Students, Mr. Lassiter here with you with a special edition key concept video, first in a short series dealing with the history of China across our time periods. A lot of people have requested some videos looking at China through the lens of the key concepts, and so here we are. We will throw in a little bit of context along the way, but for the most part, we're going to try to stick to the nuts and bolts of China. This first video will deal with China in periods 1 and 2, that is the foundational period of China and the classical era. To help you complete or to understand these videos and to make sure that you're getting enough out of them, linked down in the description below is a review packet that will be dealing with China for all of these videos. So take a look at that, print it out if you'd like, and follow along as we take a look here at China. Before we get into specifically what happens in time period 1 and 2, I want to focus primarily on the geography of China, taking a look at its unique features that allow it to develop fairly isolated from the rest of the world, developing a very unique culture that involves a lot of the unique philosophies and religious aspects, and as well as that culture that comes to define kind of Chinese power in the classical era. And we're going to start with just noticing some things on the map of China, primarily that most of the farming is done in the eastern and southeastern parts of China. And that is because of the two major rivers that flow through China. That is the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. But those rivers are really the centerpiece of Chinese civilization. The Yellow River, in fact, is where the beginning of Chinese civilization is. Now, China is also isolated by several natural land barriers. For example, the deserts of the north and northwest, the plateau of Tibet and the Himalayan mountains to the southeast, and then ocean, the Yellow Sea, the South China Sea to the east. The only area that is basically unguarded are these kind of northern steppe lands that lead to Mongolia. And of course, in this course, what that means is that is the weakness of China, and they're always going to be dealing with people from the north. So geography plays a huge role in that. Additionally, as we talked about, most of the farming is in the eastern parts of China, so that's where we will see most of the Chinese population growing in China throughout its history. And when we see trouble springing up, it's going to be in that part of the country. Now, as far as the Neolithic revolution in China, it occurs here like it does in other places around the world. Beginning about 10,000 years ago, this Neolithic revolution or agricultural revolution led to the development of new and more complex economic and social systems. Possibly as a response to changes in climate or what have you, we do see that permanent agricultural villages start to emerge. People start to settle down and farm. That becomes a more reliable way of farming. In China, this occurred in the Yellow River Valley first. Now, people in each region of the world, whether it was China or Mesopotamia or Egypt or India, they domesticated locally available plants and animals. And in China, this was predominantly different varieties of rice, as you see on the left, millet, or the domestication of animals like pigs, which you see on the far right. Although China did domesticate many other animals like cattle, and some of the animals and plants that are domesticated come to them from other regions, but nevertheless, China develops a strong agricultural civilization. Now, the first Chinese states develop in time period 1 as well. Now, keep in mind, this is only 5% of the course, but understanding it really helps lay a foundation for later. Core and foundational civilizations develop in a variety of geographical and environmental settings, including this Yellow River Valley in China. And that is really where the Shang Dynasty, as we call it, the Shang civilization of China, begins. And the first states emerge within that core civilization, so it makes sense that that was centered also on the Yellow River. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these early Chinese dynasties, really just starting comparing the Shang with the Zhou. First of all, the Shang. In this dynasty, which you see outlined on the map in front of you, the first and earliest cultural developments in China begin to take shape. You have polytheistic beliefs at this time, but in China, it was believed that people couldn't communicate directly with the gods, so instead they needed some sort of intermediary. And for them, those were their ancestors. So we start to see the process of ancestor veneration, ancestor worship begin in China as a way to speak to the gods. This, of course, was a different type of polytheism. One way that people could communicate with those gods, you see in the image in the middle, is through the use of oracle bones. And on this specific oracle bone, oftentimes tortoise shells or something along those lines, you see the development of early Chinese writing, and that occurs during the Shang Dynasty as well. The writing system begins as just pictograms and then later develops into the characters that we associate with modern Chinese writing. The Shang Dynasty was also the Bronze Age era for China. For example, the Shang Dynasty, the Shang rulers of China at the time, they held a monopoly over tin and copper, thus controlling all the development of bronze tools and weaponry. You see on the far left here a beautiful piece of bronze artwork. And the Shang Dynasty ruled China for about 700 or so years. Now, this wasn't a highly centralized state. It is not something we would really refer to even as an empire, but it is kind of the first development of a state itself within China. That is followed up by the Zhou dynasty. And this Zhou dynasty is a long-lasting dynasty from a roughly 1050 BCE to about 250 BCE, although the last couple hundred years are mired in war. As you can see in the map here on the right, the Zhou dynasty was very much a feudal dynasty. It was decentralized, relied on these small collections of states, and the Zhou just happened to be the most powerful of these. One of the ways the Zhou was able to establish legitimacy of rule is by the development of maybe what might be their most significant contribution to early Chinese culture and Chinese ruling dynasties, and that is the idea of the mandate of heaven. This was the idea that the gods chose the Zhou dynasty to rule, and that is why the Shang dynasty could be overthrown, because they had lost the mandate of the people. The Zhou will eventually fall themselves, and what we see starting to develop in China is a dynastic cycle. An old dynasty maybe taxes people too much, lets the infrastructure decay. They lose the mandate of heaven. Oftentimes that's associated with other problems, peasant revolts, invaders, whatever it might be. A new dynasty claims the mandate of heaven, overthrows the old dynasty, takes power, centralizes power, and that dynastic cycle begins again. However, under the Zhou dynasty, we do see some important developments in China that you should know and write down in your packet. This is the Iron Age. It comes to China. We see iron weapons like iron swords being used. Chariots start to be used in China. They develop crossbows. We also see the state begin to undertake irrigation projects, which of course creates even larger food surpluses than the Shang had developed. They also, under the Zhou dynasty, start to mint coins, start to mint currency, in this case mostly copper coins, and that allows trade to expand. However, in the map that you see pictured here, you'll notice that each of these different states had a different type of currency, and that could be problematic. In the classical era, that will be much more standardized. Ultimately, though, the Zhou dynasty is going to fall apart. Being that it is a feudal system, it will fall into what is known as the Warring States period. And this lasts for a few hundred years and really takes us into the classical era as these different states within this region of China, the Qi, the Song, the Zhou itself, the Qin states, as you can see here in kind of the bold black terms, they begin to fight and vie for power to win that mandate of heaven. Now, as we move into time period 2, which is about 600 BCE to 600 CE, we see new cultural and religious traditions developing China. And a lot of these develop out of the Warring States period. And that is because during this period, there is a lot of chaos in China, and people are trying to find out, what are the universal truths at work here? How do we create a harmonious society? How do we build a civilization where people can get along and chaos does not reign? There is order to that society. And there are 3 different philosophies that develop in China at this time that answer that question, each in its own way. The first is Confucianism. And Confucianism comes about with Confucius himself, who lives around the year 550 CE, BCE, right at the beginning of this classical era. And Confucius taught that it was all about relationships. That's how order was achieved in society. And he taught about 5 key relationships: ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, elder to younger, and friend to friend. And in all of these relationships, the superior, represented by the ruler or father, typically a male, had a responsibility to care for the inferior in that relationship. And in response, the inferior person, the subject, the son, the wife, they had a responsibility to obey the superior. So in the case of the Chinese government, you would have a ruler, and their responsibility is to take care of their people. And by doing so, they might have that mandate of heaven. But the people had a responsibility to obey their government. So it wasn't an absolute free-for-all. In order to really develop this understanding, Confucius believed in education above all. And it is the Confucian system of education that really will ultimately set China apart from, or in this time period, as that starts to be incorporated into the government. Confucius believed that education was simply important for becoming a good person. This system, however, was very highly patriarchal. It is associated with this term filial piety, so having respect for kind of that father figure, that parental figure. But it was patriarchal. Men, certainly in this system, were given preference over women. But it was foundational to the development of Chinese culture. A second philosophy that develops in this time period is what we call Daoism. And Daoism originates with people like Lao Tzu, or Laozi, however you want to say it, Laozi. You see him pictured here on the left, riding an ox, which is a traditional way to picture him. He was the author of the Tao Te Ching, or Tao Te Ching, depending on if you spell it with a T or a D, doesn't matter. This course typically spells it with a D. He taught that there is a balance and harmony in society, and for people to really get that order that people were striving for during the Warring States period, that they must follow the way, or the Tao. They must learn how to fit in with nature and really not interfere with it. It was believed by Taoists that by trying to do too much in directing one's life, that's where balance is thrown off. That's where chaos comes about. There's a great quote that says something to the effect of, this idea that governments should stay out of the way. They shouldn't cause problems. A government is the best type of government is one in which when they create a project, the people will think they did it themselves. Basically, the government is nearly invisible because they are not interfering in people's lives. Now, to learn about the world around them, Taoists developed a kind of an interesting culture around this belief system, and the influence of Taoism really impacts the development of Chinese culture, and you can see that in these images. In trying to understand the world around them, Taoists did a lot of work in developing medicines. Traditional Chinese medicines often have their roots in Taoism. They also wrote a lot of poetry, with trying to learn about connections with the natural world. So there's a massive influence of Taoism on Chinese poetry and art. Also, in trying to learn about the elements of earth, Taoists actually make a lot of advancements in metallurgy, which you see there in the third image. And lastly, Taoist temples typically were built in a way that tried to harmonize with nature, tried not to interfere with nature. And so Chinese architecture, which is often very distinctive, typically has been influenced by Taoism. The last of these cultural traditions, not necessarily a religion here, more of a way of ruling, is legalism. It was developed by many different people like Shang, who you see a statue of there on the left. Legalism believed in strict rules and punishments in order to keep order in society. It basically believed people were evil and would go absolutely crazy unless you had those strict rules. It was all about correct behavior. And legalism is used predominantly by the Qin in ruling their government. You see a picture here of Qin Shi Huangdi, who I will talk about momentarily. And it was even used somewhat in the Han and also later dynasties in order to gain order. But extremely harsh punishments with strict laws and rules to keep order in society. Those were the hallmarks of legalism. Now, belief systems in China generally reinforced existing social structures. We see, for example, Confucianism emphasizing filial piety. But during the Warring States period, a new belief system from outside of China even starts to come into this region. And so Buddhism during this Warring States period begins its spread into China. It had branched into many different schools and changed over time as it spread throughout Asia. It was spread through missionaries and merchants, the establishment of schools or educational institutions to promote their core teachings. But in China specifically, a type of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, Mahayana, or the great vehicle, the wide path, so to speak. It was very prevalent in China, and it was not quite as strict in belief as, say, Theravada Buddhism was in India and Southeast Asia, and that allowed it to blend with Chinese traditions. For example, the development of the belief of bodhisattvas, these enlightened people who had achieved enlightenment but had put it off in order to help their descendants perhaps achieve enlightenment as well. That blended very well with the Chinese ideas of ancestor veneration, right? Ancestors are very important in Chinese religious tradition. So this idea that perhaps Buddhism could blend with that was pretty unique in this time period. Now, all that said, the last thing I want to make sure that you know is that a continuity of culture and religious belief occur in time period 2 with time period 1, and that is that ancestor veneration does persist in China throughout this era. It doesn't go away or get replaced by Confucianism or Daoism or Mahayana Buddhism. It's still there and still prevalent. Now, beyond these cultural developments which occurred during the Warring States period, and if you ever get kind of confused by some of the dates as we move through, actually, if you go to the end of the packet, you have some important dates there that might help you develop it. Feel free to add some of your own. But in the classical era, we see the development of Chinese empires. And, in the previous time period, we see really just kind of dynastic, but more so feudal rulers. Here in this classical era, it is centralized governments that rule large territories. So from 600 BCE to 600 CE, throughout the world, the number and size of key states and empires grew dramatically. In China, two major empires emerge, and those are the Qin Dynasty and the Han Dynasty. The Qin Empire was short-lived. It only was around for about 15 years or so, from 221 BCE to 206. And it was led by the guy you see pictured here, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, who unified China under legalism. He centralized the government. He built the Great Wall, mobilized people to build the Great Wall to protect China from the northern nomadic problems that they were having. He also expanded the empire. But even more so than that, he sought to in centralizing that government, he found the tools to do so. For example, he standardizes weights and measures. He standardizes the writing system of China. There had been several different types of writing used in different regions of China. He makes that all the same in order to improve communication. He builds roads and canals, and his ability to mobilize large groups of people was really a product of these methods, but also just a very harsh way of treating the people and a very strong legalist way of governing. One of the best examples of how he's able to mobilize people is this terracotta army, which you see pictured here. The terracotta soldiers at the tomb of Shi Huangdi. He dies from mercury poisoning, trying to achieve immortality with some of that Daoist medicine we talked about. But the terracotta army is one of kind of the great world treasures, consisting of thousands of unique figures, life-size soldier figures, as well as horses and charioteers and all sorts of things, at a massive grave complex. And just for the fragility of it, we can't even unearth all of it. But that is one of the things that really stands out about the Qin Empire. Qin Shi Huangdi is really the only significant emperor from this empire. His son rules for a brief period of time, but he is quickly overthrown by a rival state, and that is the Han. Now, the Han Empire is a golden age of China. It lasted for about 400 years, from 206 BCE to about 220 CE. Its government starts out very much legalist, but over time, it starts to incorporate Confucianism. And this is important because it is developing a bureaucracy. That is, a system of government in which the most important decisions are not made by elected representatives or local leaders, but instead by the central government and workers for the central government who are directly loyal to the ruler, or in this case, the emperor. So the development of this bureaucracy really relied on an exam system and and highly educated peoples. Well, what was providing the education in China, or what was education based around? Oftentimes it was based around Confucianism. So the Han Dynasty, even though it starts out legalistic, starts to incorporate Confucianism out of a necessity for creating this bureaucracy, this meritocracy based on who the best, the brightest, the most educated people are. Now, beyond that, the Han Dynasty, they have several innovations. They start to mint coins, and they invent paper, and they have rudimentary clocks and all sorts of things. The Silk Road trade begins under the Han Dynasty. One of the things that they must deal with, and one of the things that really stands out throughout this time period, is that they are constantly dealing with nomadic people on their border, especially to the north, this group called the Xiongnu. Xiongnu, the Xiongnu. And so the Han Dynasty are almost always engaging in warfare with them. Of course, they shore up and expand the Great Wall that started under the Qin Empire. And they also use diplomacy to connect with people in the West to fight against and eventually defeat the Xiongnu. And that brings me to how they were able to hold on to power, right? The classical empires, whether it's Rome or the Mauryan or Gupta empires of India or China, they developed new techniques of imperial administration based in part on things that had worked for previous groups. So in organizing their subjects, they created administrative institutions and bureaucracies, which you see here in the top left with this civil service exam system. They also promoted trade in their empire because that typically gave a lot of wealth, allowed people to centralize, and they did that through the use of copper coins and coining money. In defending their land and maintaining control over it, they expanded the Great Wall of China. That was, of course, started under Qin Shi Huangdi, but continues under the Han. And there's actually many different iterations. The picture you see here isn't even the version that the Han had. It came along much later, but you get the idea. There's also a strategy of using diplomacy. It's not all about warfare, right, and defending yourself. It's also working with those around you. So the Han made alliances with people out in the western parts of, or the areas to the west of China, to the west of their empire, and basically teamed up to protect the region from these nomadic groups. And then lastly, building large armies from their citizenry, here represented by the terracotta army of the Qin Empire, of Qin Shi Huangdi. They would draft people into military service and use that military to project power over long distances. This isn't the only thing that was used. The building of roads and canals also play a role in this, allowing people to exert power over areas that are far away, and that also facilitates trade as well. Beyond this, we do see in the classical era, under the Qin and the Han, unique social and economic dimensions that develop in their societies. And in your review packet, I actually have a list of some key concepts, and I'm just going to go through some Chinese examples of some of these unique social and economic dimensions that help define China. The first thing that we see is that in order to serve as centers for trade or religious rituals, or just for the administration of empires, we see the development of imperial cities, capital cities or large trade centers. A great example in China is what you see here pictured on the far left. That is Chang'an, which was the capital of the Han and then later other Chinese dynasties. And that really serves as that center of trade, the center of religious ritual, and the center of the Chinese bureaucracy. Furthermore, the social structures of empires displayed hierarchies. And in China, there's a really interesting social hierarchy. At the top, of course, you have the emperor, right? He's ruling over everything. But below the emperor, you have the palace court, nobles, government officials, and below them, kind of surprisingly, are peasants, the farmers of China, who were held to a very high standard. This hierarchy really represents that influence of Confucianism in classical China. Bureaucrats at top, they're the educated, peasants above merchants, because they create for society and help create order by growing food. Thirdly, imperial societies relied on a range of methods to maintain the production of food and provide for society. In China, this was done through the use of corvée labor, which you actually see kind of out of order here on the far right. The use of basically labor as a tax. So people would owe a certain amount of labor either in military service or in public work service to the state. And through this coerced labor, China was able to build up its infrastructure. And the last thing we see, which is actually here in the third image, is that patriarchy continued to shape gender and familial relations in imperial societies, including China. This idea of patriarchy in China, it's all about filial piety, Confucianism. We've already gone over that, so I won't belabor the point anymore. Now, the Han Dynasty in classical China does not stick around forever. And so when we think about the fall of classical dynasties, they all come down before the end of this time period, the Han included. And the first reason really why we see the Han fall is simply because there are social tensions and economic difficulties. In China, it was increased wealth inequality. Peasants certainly were very unhappy by this, about this. In fact, in the year 184, basically a 20-year revolt called the Yellow Turban Revolt, which you see pictured here, killed millions of people and permanently weakened the Han Dynasty, eventually leading to its downfall. Also, in defending the empire, heavy tax burdens were especially difficult on the peasants of China, along with, of course, with warfare, with climate change, with weather patterns. You have at times droughts or famines that can increase dissatisfaction among peasants. That'll be a theme throughout China's history. The second thing that we see is that security issues and threats of invasions challenged authority. In China, it was all about the Xiongnu and then the Central Asian nomadic groups. Those always put pressure on China. It was always very costly to defend against them, and thus you had high taxes and you had eventual instability, especially as the Han Dynasty begins to weaken. And the last thing, thinking about other factors in the fall of the Han Dynasty, with trade, which we'll cover in just a second, we see disease spread along the Silk Roads, especially. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and the plague definitely hit China hard. Something like a quarter of their population die from disease in the last 50 or 80 years of the Han Dynasty. Eventually, the emperor of the Han Dynasty is overthrown in the year 220 CE, and China falls back into kind of a feudal period of multiple kingdoms and warring states. Now, all that is said, and we haven't really talked much about trade. And so I just really want to cover trade in China and the Silk Road especially, which begins really under the Han Dynasty as we see the connection of China to the classical empires of India, Persia, and ultimately all the way to Rome. The Silk Road is a land trade route that allowed for trans-regional trade and communication between China and the rest of the world. We see lots of different technologies, goods, food, ideas, and diseases spread along the Silk Roads. If you want more information on this, I point you to my key concept videos on trade in this time period and others. But as far as China goes, goods that they tended to trade along the Silk Road, they exported silk. Of course, spices were traded from India and China both. Cotton was traded to China. Mostly things that had high value, low weight ratios. As far as food, rice spreads along the Silk Roads into Central Asia. Basically anywhere that rice goes, Buddhism goes. Beyond that, technologies spread. For example, knowledge of irrigation, and some of those things spread to China. For example, the use of the Qanat system from Persia makes its way all the way to China. And then, of course, there are technologies which help speed up trade, things like stirrups, saddles, yokes for oxen or beasts of burden. And those technologies also spread along these Silk Roads. As far as ideas go, we see the spread of religions. We've already talked about the spread of Buddhism, but other religions also spread. For example, by the end of this time period, Christianity, especially Nestorian Christianity, will have spread on the Silk Road and arrived in western parts of China. In our next time period, it'll be Islam that spreads. And lastly, disease. We've already mentioned that as a factor in the fall of the Han Dynasty, but smallpox, measles, and the plague all wreak havoc on China at one time or another. So that is it for key concepts from periods 1 and 2 dealing with China. This video was a little bit longer than I anticipated, mainly because we were laying so many foundational aspects for China. But we'll come back with units 3 and 4 in our next video, and then cover 5 and 6 in the third and final installment of this review of China. Thank you for listening, and have a good day. See you in the next video.